Jake Morrison had never seen water so blue in his entire life. Back home in Virginia, the rivers ran muddy brown most of the year, and the local swimming hole barely counted as more than a pond. But here in California, standing on Santa Monica Beach with his work boots buried in the warm sand, he felt like he'd stepped into one of those travel magazines his mom kept on the coffee table. 3 years of saving every extra dollar had finally paid off. While his buddies back home spent their paychecks at the local bar, Jake had been tucking away $20 here, $50 there, dreaming of this moment. His boss had called him crazy for taking a whole week off work, especially during their busy season, but Jake didn't care. At 28, he'd never been anywhere farther than Richmond, and California felt like another planet. The motel where he was staying wasn't much to look at. The carpet had probably been orange once, and the air conditioner made sounds like his old pickup truck on a cold morning. But it was clean, and more importantly, it was all he could afford after buying the plane ticket. He'd packed enough peanut butter sandwiches to last the week, determined to make this trip work on his construction worker's budget. Now, walking along the beach on his second morning, Jake couldn't stop grinning. Families were setting up umbrellas, kids were building sandcastles, and somewhere nearby a radio was playing music he'd never heard before. Everything felt different here. Even the air smelled different, salty and warm, nothing like the sawdust and engine oil he was used to. But as Jake watched the waves, his smile faded a little. Growing up near rivers and ponds, he knew water, and this ocean was angry today. The waves looked pretty from a distance, sure, but he could see the way they pulled and pushed, creating currents that most of these tourists probably didn't even notice. During his 2 years as a volunteer firefighter back home, he'd pulled enough people out of rivers to know when water was dangerous. He'd been walking for about 20 minutes when he first spotted her. A young woman, maybe mid-20s, with long dark hair and wearing the kind of simple blue swimsuit you could buy at any store. She was alone, which struck him as odd since most people here seemed to be with friends or family. She'd been sitting on her towel for a while, just staring at the water like she was working up the courage for something. Jake almost kept walking. It wasn't his business what other people did with their day. But something made him glance back over his shoulder, and when he did, he saw her getting up and walking toward the water with the kind of determined stride that usually meant trouble. The woman waded in slowly at first, like someone who wasn't completely comfortable in water. That should have been Jake's first warning sign. The second should have been how she kept going deeper, even when waves knocked her sideways. But what really got his attention was when she tried to dive under a particularly large wave and came up sputtering and disoriented. Jake stopped walking completely now, his hands shading his eyes as he watched her. She was maybe 50 yards from shore, which wasn't far in calm water. But these weren't calm waters, and she clearly wasn't a strong swimmer. He could see her starting to panic as the current began pulling her sideways, away from where she'd entered the water. For a moment, Jake hesitated. He'd left his phone back at the motel, figuring he wouldn't need it for a simple beach walk. There were lifeguards somewhere, but he couldn't spot one nearby. Other beachgoers seemed focused on their own activities, and most probably couldn't see what he was seeing from his angle. The woman's head disappeared under a wave and took longer to resurface than it should have. When she came up, Jake could hear her shouting, though he couldn't make out the words over the sound of the waves. That decided it for him. He kicked off his shoes and pulled his wallet from his pocket, tossing both onto the sand without caring where they landed. His t-shirt followed, and then he was running toward the water, his mind already shifting into the emergency mode he'd learned during those firefighter training sessions. The water was shockingly cold against his skin, nothing like the warm rivers back home. But Jake pushed through it, diving under the waves when he had to, swimming hard when he could. His construction work had kept him in decent shape, but fighting ocean currents was different from lifting lumber or swinging a hammer. By the time he reached her, the woman was in real trouble. Her movements had become frantic and uncoordinated, the kind of thrashing that uses up energy fast and doesn't get you anywhere. Jake could see the fear in her eyes when she spotted him approaching. Hey, it's okay," he called out, trying to project calm even though his own heart was racing. "I'm going to help you, but I need you to stop fighting the water for a second." Up close, he could see she was younger than he'd thought, probably early 20s. Her dark hair was plastered to her head, and she had the pale skin of someone who spent more time indoors than out. But what struck him most was the genuine terror in her brown eyes. I can't swim back," she gasped, water lapping at her chin with each wave. "You don't have to," Jake said, moving closer carefully. He'd learned that panicked swimmers could be dangerous, sometimes pulling their rescuers under with them. "Just grab onto me and let me do the work, okay? But whatever you do, don't grab my neck." She nodded, though he could see she was still on the edge of panic. Jake positioned himself beside her, letting her grip his shoulder while he started the slow process of fighting their way back to shore. The rip current that had pulled her out was still working against them, and twice Jake thought they might not make it. His lungs burned and his arms ached, but he kept swimming. Back home, he'd helped pull a drunk teenager out of the Shenandoah River during a flash flood, and he'd learned then that rescue swimming was more about endurance than speed. You had to pace yourself, work with the water when you could, and never give up. What felt like hours later, but was probably only 10 minutes, Jake felt his feet touch sand. They were both exhausted, the woman barely conscious, but they'd made it. Other beachgoers had noticed the commotion by now, and someone was already calling 911 on their phone. As they staggered onto the beach, the woman collapsed onto the sand, coughing up seawater. Jake knelt beside her, his construction worker's hand surprisingly gentle as he helped her sit up. "You're okay," he said, and meant it. "You're going to be just fine." She looked up at him then, really looked at him, and Jake saw something in her expression that he couldn't quite identify. Gratitude, yes, but something else too. Something like surprise, as if she hadn't expected a stranger to risk his life for hers. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the salt water. I really thought. "Don't think about it," Jake said simply. Anyone would have done the same thing. But even as he said it, he wasn't sure that was true. And from the way she was looking at him, he had a feeling she wasn't sure either. The paramedics arrived faster than Jake expected, their red and white ambulance cutting through the beach crowd like something out of a movie. Back in Virginia, emergency response took longer because everything was spread out over country roads and small towns. But here in California, it seemed like help was always just around the corner. "Sir, we need you to step back, please," one of the paramedics said. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes and hands that moved with practiced efficiency. She knelt beside the young woman Jake had pulled from the water, checking her pulse and breathing. Jake started to move away, but a weak voice stopped him. "Wait," the woman said, reaching out toward him. "Please don't go." I don't know anyone here." The paramedic looked between them. "Are you family?" "No," Jake said quickly. I pulled her out of the water." "He saved my life," the woman added, still coughing slightly. "Please, can he stay?" The paramedic nodded. "Just give us some room to work." Jake stepped back but didn't leave. He watched as they checked her over, asking questions about pain and dizziness. His wet clothes were starting to make him cold in the ocean breeze, but he ignored it. Something about the way she'd asked him to stay tugged at him. She seemed so alone, and he knew what that felt like. After 20 minutes of tests and questions, the paramedics declared that both of them were okay. No signs of serious injury, though they recommended rest and plenty of fluids. Jake had a few scrapes on his arms from fighting the waves, but nothing that wouldn't heal on its own. "You're lucky," the female paramedic told the woman. "That rip current could have pulled you out much farther. Your friend here knew what he was doing." When the ambulance drove away, Jake found himself standing alone on the beach with the woman he'd rescued. She was wrapped in a towel someone had given her, her dark hair still damp and messy from the salt water. For the first time he really looked at her, she was pretty, but not in the flashy way of the California girls he'd seen on TV. Her face had a natural quality to it, and when she wasn't panicked, her brown eyes held an intelligence that made him curious about who she was. She couldn't be much older than 25, he guessed. "I'm Riley," she said, extending her hand, "and I owe you everything." "Jake," he replied, shaking her hand. Her grip was firmer than he'd expected. "And you don't owe me anything. I'm just glad you're okay." Riley looked around the beach, which was starting to empty as afternoon tea earned toward evening. "I should probably get going, but—" She hesitated. "I know this might sound weird, but would you maybe want to grab some food? I'm starving and I'd really like to thank you properly." Jake glanced down at his still damp clothes and sandy feet. "I'm not exactly dressed for anywhere nice." "Who said anything about nice?" Riley smiled, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked genuinely relaxed. There's got to be a burger place around here somewhere. 20 minutes later, they were sitting across from each other in a small diner about 3 blocks from the beach. The kind of place with red vinyl booths and a menu that looked like it hadn't changed since the 1980s. Jake had retrieved his shoes and wallet from the beach sand, and though his hair was still messy from the salt water, he felt more like himself in dry clothes. "So," Riley said, stirring sugar into her coffee, "what brings someone from—" She paused, listening to his accent. "Virginia? North Carolina?" "Virginia," Jake confirmed. "Small town about an hour west of Richmond. And this is my first real vacation in about 3 years." "Really? What do you do back home?" Jake felt the familiar slight embarrassment he always experienced when talking to strangers about his job. Not because he was ashamed of construction work, but because people sometimes made assumptions about guys who worked with their hands. "Construction," he said simply. "Mostly residential stuff. House repairs, renovations, some new builds when the economy's good." But Riley's face lit up with genuine interest instead of the polite smile he usually got. "That's amazing. You actually build things that last. I mean, you create homes where families live their whole lives." Jake blinked, surprised by her reaction. "I never really thought about it that way. Most days it's just fixing leaky roofs and replacing rotted deck boards." "But you're solving problems," Riley insisted, "making things better than they were before. That's gotta feel good." "Yeah," Jake said slowly, "it does. Especially when it's for folks who couldn't afford to hire the big companies. My neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, she's been living with a broken front step for 2 years because she can't afford to get it fixed properly. Last month I finally convinced her to let me do it for free." Riley studied his face as he talked, and Jake found himself opening up in a way he rarely did with strangers. There was something about her attention that felt genuine, like she actually cared about his answers instead of just making conversation. "What about you?" he asked. "What do you do?" Riley's hesitation was so brief that Jake almost missed it. "I'm a student," she said. "Art school. Photography mostly. Still trying to figure out what I want to do with my life, you know?" Jake nodded. "That's cool. I always wished I was more creative. I can fix just about anything with my hands, but ask me to draw something and you'd think a 5-year-old did it." "Creativity comes in lots of forms," Riley said. "What you do with construction, that's creative too. You have to visualize how things should look. Problem solve when materials don't fit right. That's art." They talked through 2 cups of coffee and a shared plate of fries. Jake found himself telling her about his hometown, about the way morning fog rolled through the mountains and how you could still see every star in the sky on clear nights. He talked about his co-workers, guys he'd known since high school who still gave him grief about reading books in his spare time. Riley listened to all of it with an attention that felt almost hungry, like she was storing up every detail. She asked questions about his family, about what it was like growing up in a place where everyone knew everyone else's business. "It sounds peaceful," she said wistfully. "I grew up in the city. Always noise, always people rushing around. Sometimes I think about what it would be like to live somewhere quiet." "Where in the city?" Jake asked, another tiny hesitation. "Los Angeles. My family's still there." "But you're in school here?" "Yeah, I needed some space from them. You know how families can be." Jake did know, though his family situation was different. His parents had died in a car accident when he was 22, and these days it was mostly just him and his grandmother, who called every Sunday to make sure he was eating enough vegetables. As the sun started to set outside the diner window, Jake realized they'd been talking for almost 3 hours. He couldn't remember the last time a conversation had felt this easy, this natural. Riley seemed genuinely interested in his life, asking follow-up questions about things most people would have glossed over. When the waitress brought their check, Jake reached for his wallet, but Riley was faster. "This is the least I can do," she said. "You saved my life today. You really don't have to." "I want to," Riley said firmly. "Please." Outside the diner, they stood awkwardly on the sidewalk as the California evening settled around them. Jake realized he didn't want this day to end, but he also didn't know how to say that without sounding presumptuous. "I should probably get back to my hotel," Riley said, though she didn't move to leave. "Yeah, me too. Early flight tomorrow, back to reality." "Oh." Riley's face fell slightly. "You're leaving tomorrow?" "Unfortunately. Vacation time's over." Riley pulled out her phone, fingers hovering over the screen. "Would you? I mean, if you ever wanted to stay in touch. Email or something." "I'd really like that." Jake's heart jumped a little. I'd like that too. She typed something quickly and handed him the phone. Jake entered his number, then gave it back so she could call him and he'd have hers. Take care of yourself, Jake said as they parted ways, and maybe stay out of rip currents for a while. Riley laughed, the sound carrying on the warm evening air. I promise. And Jake, thank you for everything. Jake walked back to his motel with a lightness in his step he hadn't felt in months. In his pocket, his phone buzzed with a text from Riley. Safe travels tomorrow. This was the best day I've had in a long time. He didn't know it yet, but the number she'd given him belonged to a phone she'd thrown away in a gas station trash can on her way back to her hotel. Some lies, she told herself, were kinder than the truth. Jake stared at his phone screen for the 15th time that morning, reading the same error message. The number you have dialed is not in service. He'd been trying to reach Riley for 3 days now, ever since he got back to Virginia, and each failed call made his stomach sink a little deeper. Maybe he'd copied the number wrong. Maybe she'd changed her mind about staying in touch. Maybe the whole conversation at the diner had meant more to him than it had to her. Jake set the phone down on his workbench and picked up his hammer, trying to lose himself in the rhythm of replacing deckboards on Mrs. Patterson's back porch. You've been checking that phone all week, called out Tommy, his work partner for the past 5 years. Tommy was rebuilding the porch railing a few feet away and nothing much got past him. Girl troubles? Something like that, Jake muttered, driving a nail harder than necessary. Want to talk about it? Jake considered telling Tommy about California, about Riley, about how 3 hours in a diner had somehow become the best part of his whole vacation. But how could he explain that he'd been thinking about a woman he'd known for less than a day? How could he admit that he'd been checking his phone like a teenager waiting for his first girlfriend to call? Not much to talk about, Jake said instead. Just thought I made a connection with someone. But I guess I was wrong, 3 states away. Riley sat in her father's office on the 42nd floor of the Castellano Tech building, her hands folded in her lap like she was 12 years old again and had been caught skipping school. The office was all glass and steel, with a view of downtown Los Angeles that cost more per square foot than most people made in a year. Robert Castellano didn't look up from his computer screen when his daughter walked in. At 58, he'd built his tech empire from nothing, and he still worked 16-hour days as if the whole thing might disappear if he blinked. His gray hair was perfectly styled, his suit probably cost more than Jake's truck, and his attention was a commodity that even his own daughter had to schedule in advance. You missed 3 security check-ins last week, he said without looking up. Mitchell was ready to call the FBI. Dad, I need to tell you something. Something in Riley's tone finally made him look up from his screen. She was wearing jeans and a simple t-shirt, the kind of clothes that made his personal shopper wince but that Riley insisted on when she wasn't making public appearances for the company. This better not be about art school again, Robert said. We've discussed this. You have responsibilities to the company, to the family name. I almost drowned last week. That got his full attention. Robert leaned back in his leather chair, his business mask slipping for just a moment to show genuine concern. What happened? Riley told him everything. About sneaking away from her security detail, about going to the beach alone, about the rip current and the panic and the certainty that she was going to die in that cold water. She told him about Jake, about his calloused hands and his Virginia accent and the way he'd risked his own life without even knowing her name. You gave a stranger your real name? Robert's voice had gone dangerously quiet. Just my first name. And I told him I was an art student. Dad, he saved my life and he has no idea who I really am. Robert was already reaching for his phone. I'll have Mitchell track him down. We'll arrange appropriate compensation. No. Riley stood up, her voice sharper than she usually used with her father. I don't want you turning this into some kind of business transaction. This man risked everything for a complete stranger. He doesn't want money. Everyone wants money, Riley. You're just too naive to see it yet. But Robert made the calls anyway. Within 48 hours, his team of private investigators had tracked down Jake Morrison of Millfield, Virginia. Construction worker, volunteer firefighter, no criminal record, parents deceased. Living alone in a rented apartment above Murphy's hardware store. Clean credit, modest savings account. Drove a 15-year-old pickup truck that probably should have been retired years ago. He's either exactly what he appears to be, or he's the best con artist I've ever seen, Mitchell reported during their Monday morning security briefing. No social media presence to speak of. pays his bills on time, hasn't Googled your daughter's name even once since California. Robert studied the surveillance photos on his desk. Jake looked younger in the pictures than Riley had described, though there was something solid about him that even the grainy images couldn't hide. He was photographed leaving work, grocery shopping, stopping by the library. The most exciting thing he'd done all week was help an elderly neighbor carry groceries up a flight of stairs. Set up a meeting, Robert decided. I want to thank him properly. 3 weeks later, Jake was 30 feet up on scaffolding, replacing rotted siding on the Hendersons' house, when he heard the vehicles. At first he thought maybe the fire department was responding to a call somewhere nearby. But when he looked down, he saw 3 black SUVs parked in the Hendersons' driveway and his blood went cold. Nobody in Millfield drove cars like that. Jake had seen enough movies to know that black SUVs usually meant federal agents or very wealthy people, and he couldn't think of any reason why either would be looking for him. The passenger door of the middle SUV opened, and Riley stepped out. Jake nearly dropped his hammer. She looked different here, more polished somehow, wearing clothes that probably cost more than he made in a month. Her hair was styled instead of messy, and she moved with the kind of confidence that money bought. But it was definitely her. Jake, she called up to him. Could you come down? We need to talk. Jake climbed down the scaffolding slowly, his mind racing. How had she found him? Why was she here? And why did she look like she'd stepped out of a magazine instead of the simple art student he'd met in California? Riley? Jake's voice came out rougher than he intended. What are you doing here? She looked nervous now that they were face to face, nothing like the confident woman who'd stepped out of the SUV. I wanted to see you again. To thank you properly. Thank me properly? Jake looked at the convoy of vehicles, at the suited men standing nearby who were obviously security guards, at Riley herself in her expensive clothes. Who are you really? The question hung in the air between them. Jake could see his co-workers gathering on neighboring porches, drawn by the unusual sight of luxury vehicles on their quiet street. Mrs. Patterson was peering through her curtains, and Jake knew that by evening, everyone in town would be talking about this. My name is Riley Castellano, she said quietly. My father owns Castellano Technologies. Jake felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. Castellano Technologies. Even in small-town Virginia, people knew that name. The company was worth billions, had offices in 12 countries, employed tens of thousands of people. And the man who owned it had a daughter. You lied to me, Jake said, and the hurt in his voice was impossible to hide. Art student? Struggling to figure out your life? All of that was just, it wasn't all lies, Riley said quickly. The way I felt talking to you, that was real. Everything I said about wanting to live somewhere quiet, about needing space for my family, that was true. But you let me tell you about my life, about my job, about Mrs. Patterson's front steps, and the whole time you were probably thinking how quaint it all was, how amusing. No, Jake, that's not. You gave me a fake number. The realization hit him like cold water. You never intended to see me again. This whole thing showing up here with your security team, this is just you feeling guilty about lying to the poor construction worker who pulled you out of the water. One of the security guards stepped forward, but Riley waved him back. Jake, please listen to me. I don't want to hear it. Jake's voice was getting louder now, and he could see curtains twitching in windows all up and down the street. And I don't want whatever you came here to give me. Money, job offers, whatever kind of charity you think I need. I was happy before you showed up, and I'll be happy after you leave. It's not charity, Riley said, tears starting to form in her eyes. I wanted to see you again because you're the first person who's talked to me like I was just a normal person in, God, I can't even remember how long. Jake looked at her standing there in her designer clothes next to vehicles that cost more than most people's houses, and all he could think about was how real she'd seemed in that diner, how interested she'd been in his stories about small-town life, how she'd looked at him like he mattered. Maybe that's because you're not a normal person, Jake said, and his voice had gone quiet and cold. Maybe you never were. He turned and walked back toward the scaffolding, dismissing her as clearly as if he'd slammed a door. Behind him, he heard car doors closing and engines starting. By the time he looked down again, the black SUVs were disappearing around the corner, leaving nothing behind but the smell of expensive exhaust and the knowledge that he'd been a fool. That night, Jake's phone rang constantly. Reporters, somehow having gotten hold of the story, wanted to interview the small-town hero who'd saved a billionaire's daughter. Jake unplugged his landline and turned off his cell phone. But it didn't stop the vans with satellite dishes that appeared outside his apartment the next morning. For the first time since he'd pulled Riley from those California waves, Jake wished he'd just kept walking on the beach that day. The reporters stayed for 3 days. Jake watched from his apartment window as news vans lined the street like vultures, their satellite dishes pointed skyward and their crews waiting for any glimpse of the small-town hero. By the second day, he'd stopped going to work entirely. Every time he stepped outside, microphones appeared in his face and questions flew at him like angry wasps. How does it feel to save a billionaire's daughter? Did you know who she was when you rescued her? Are you dating Riley Castellano? What do you think about the reward her father is offering? Jake had no idea what reward they were talking about, and he didn't want to know. He'd called his boss and taken the rest of the week off, claiming he had the flu. It wasn't entirely a lie. The stress was making him feel sick to his stomach most of the time. Tommy brought him groceries on the third day, sneaking up the back stairs to avoid the cameras. "This is crazy, man," Tommy said, unpacking milk and bread on Jake's small kitchen counter. "They've got reporters asking questions at the diner, at the hardware store, even at the post office. Mrs. Patterson told one of them that you're the finest young man in 3 counties, and if they bothered you anymore, she'd call her nephew who works for the sheriff's department." Jake almost smiled at that. Mrs. Patterson was 74 and barely 5 feet tall, but she was fierce when it came to protecting people she cared about. "Has it occurred to any of them that maybe I don't want to talk?" Jake asked. "Rich people's news is different than regular people's news, I guess," Tommy said. "They're treating this like some kind of fairy tale. Poor boy meets rich girl, you know." "It's not a fairy tale," Jake said quietly. "It's just a mess." On the 4th morning, Jake woke up to silence. No camera crews, no reporters shouting questions, no satellite dishes cluttering his street. When he peered out his window, the vans were gone, leaving only some scattered coffee cups and cigarette butts as evidence they'd ever been there. Jake ventured outside cautiously, half expecting cameras to appear from behind parked cars. But the street was normal again. Just neighbors going about their business and kids riding bikes on the sidewalk. Whatever had pulled the media circus away from Millfield had been bigger news than his story. He was walking to Murphy's Hardware to pick up some supplies when he saw her. Riley was sitting on the bench outside the post office, wearing jeans and a simple gray sweater, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. She looked smaller somehow, less polished than she had when she'd arrived with her security team, more like the woman he'd met in California. Jake's first instinct was to turn around and walk away. But something about the way she was sitting, shoulders slightly hunched, hands clasped in her lap, made him stop. She looked as tired as he felt. "Where's your convoy?" Jake asked, approaching the bench but not sitting down. Riley looked up and he could see dark circles under her eyes. "I sent them home. Flew commercial, rented a car at the airport. My father thinks I've lost my mind. Maybe you have. Maybe." Riley shifted over on the bench, an invitation for him to sit. Jake hesitated, then sat down, leaving space between them. "I called off the media." "How do you call off the media? When your father owns enough advertising dollars, news directors take your calls." Riley's voice was bitter. "I told them the story was over, that there would be no interviews, no reward ceremonies, no thing." They moved on to the next scandal. They sat in silence for a moment, watching life happen in small-town Virginia. Mrs. Henderson walked by with her shopping bags, nodding politely to both of them. A group of teenagers skateboarded past, their wheels loud on the sidewalk. Normal life, the kind Jake had always taken for granted. "I need you to understand something," Riley said finally. "I didn't lie to you because I thought it was funny. I lied because I've never had a conversation like the one we had in that diner. Not once in my entire life." Jake kept his eyes on the street. "You could have told me the truth. Could I have?" Riley turned to face him. "If I'd said, 'Hi, I'm Riley Castellano. My father's worth about $8 billion, what would you have done?'" Jake thought about it honestly. "I probably would have assumed you were making fun of me, or you would have seen dollar signs, or you would have treated me like I was made of glass, or you would have been so uncomfortable that you wouldn't have been yourself anymore." Riley's voice got quieter. "Do you know what it's like to never know if someone likes you or if they like what you can do for them?" "No," Jake admitted. "I don't. I've had people pretend to be my friend so they could get jobs at my father's company. I've had guys ask me out because they wanted to be photographed with me. I've had teachers give me better grades because they hoped my family would donate to their schools. Riley wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. That diner in California was the first time in years that someone talked to me like I was just a person. Jake felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the anger he'd been carrying. So you threw it away by giving me a fake number. I panicked, Riley said. I thought if we tried to stay in touch, eventually you'd figure out who I really was and everything would change. I thought it was better to keep that one perfect evening exactly as it was, instead of taking the chance that maybe it wouldn't change everything. Instead of that, yeah. A delivery truck rumbled past, heading toward the hardware store. Jake recognized the driver, Bill Morrison, no relation despite the same last name, and raised his hand in greeting. Bill waved back, probably wondering who the woman was, but too polite to stare. Can I ask you something? Riley said. Sure. What's it like to live in a place where people wave at you just because they recognize your face? Where your neighbor brings you groceries when you're sick, and an old lady threatens reporters who bother you. Jake looked around at his hometown, really seeing it through her eyes for the first time. It's nice, I guess, but it can be limiting, too. Everyone knows your business. When my parents died, I couldn't go anywhere without people asking how I was doing. After a while, you just want to be left alone with your grief. But they cared enough to ask. Yeah, they did. Riley was quiet for a long moment. I've been thinking about what you said, about not being a normal person. You're right. I'm not. But sitting here with you, talking like this feels normal. This feels real. Jake studied her profile as she watched a family walk by, parents pushing a stroller while their toddler ran ahead on unsteady legs. There was something wistful in her expression, like she was watching something she'd never had. What's your normal day like? Jake asked. Riley laughed, but there wasn't much humor in it. Meetings, mostly. Board meetings, charity meetings, meetings about what meetings I need to attend next week, photo shoots for the company website, dinners where I'm supposed to charm investors or smile at politicians. I have an assistant who schedules 15-minute blocks for phone calls with my own father. That sounds awful. Parts of it are. But I also get to help decide where we donate millions of dollars every year. I got to help design a program that gives scholarships to kids whose parents can't afford college. Last month, I helped approve funding for a rural internet project that will connect 50 small towns to high-speed service. Riley turned to look at him. I'm not complaining about my life, Jake. I know how lucky I am. But lucky doesn't always mean happy. Jake thought about his own life, the satisfaction of fixing things with his hands, the simplicity of problems that could be solved with the right tools and enough elbow grease, the way his neighbors looked out for each other. Then he tried to imagine growing up the way Riley had, never knowing if relationships were real, always being watched and judged and treated like a symbol instead of a person. I'm sorry, he said finally. For what? For not trying to understand. For assuming the worst about you. Jake rubbed his hands together, noticing how rough they looked next to her smooth ones. And for being so angry about the lies. I get why you did it now. Does that mean you forgive me? Jake was quiet for a long moment, watching the afternoon shadows lengthen across the street. I'm working on it, he said finally. But I need you to understand something too. I may not have money, but I have pride. And it hurt to find out that someone I cared about didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth. I know, Riley said softly. And I'm sorry. I'm sorrier than I know how to say. They sat together on the bench as the sun began to set. Two people from completely different worlds trying to build a bridge across the gap between them. It wasn't perfect and it wasn't easy, but for the first time since that disaster with the black SUVs, it felt like something real. Can I buy you dinner? Riley asked as the streetlights started to flicker on. Somewhere normal. No security guards, no fancy cars, just us and maybe another conversation. Jake looked at her sitting there in her simple clothes, without makeup or jewelry or any of the armor that wealth usually provided. She looked nervous, hopeful, and very young. I know a place, Jake said, standing up and offering his hand. But I'm paying this time. Riley smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since California. Deal. 6 months later, Jake was teaching a group of teenagers how to properly use a circular saw when he heard the familiar sound of Riley's rental car pulling into the community center parking lot. He'd gotten used to that sound she'd been making, the drive from Los Angeles to Millfield, almost every weekend since their conversation, on the bench outside the post office. "Remember what I told you about keeping your fingers away from the blade?" Jake called out to the kids, though his eyes followed Riley as she walked toward the workshop they'd set up in the old building. She was wearing work clothes now, jeans with actual paint stains, steel-toed boots that had seen real use, and a t-shirt advertising the Millfield Water Safety Program. That program had been Riley's idea, born out of a conversation they'd had about how many rural kids never learned to swim properly. What had started as her suggestion to fund swimming lessons had grown into something much bigger, a comprehensive water safety education program that Jake now ran in 5 counties across Virginia. "Miss Riley," called out 15-year-old Danny, who was sanding a piece of wood for the canoe paddle he was making. "Did you bring those life jackets you promised?" "They're in my car," Riley said, ruffling his hair. "But you finish that paddle first. I want to see it before you test it out on the river." Jake watched her interact with the kids and felt the same warmth he'd been feeling more and more often lately. Riley had a natural way with people when she wasn't worried about being judged or used. These teenagers didn't care about her last name or her father's money. They just knew her as the woman who helped fund their programs and who showed up every weekend to work alongside them. The water safety program had become something neither of them had expected. What started as swimming lessons had expanded to include basic boat building, river rescue techniques, and even CPR certification. Jake taught the hands-on skills while Riley handled the organization and funding. They'd already trained over 200 kids and adults, and requests were coming in from other states wanting to start similar programs. "How was the drive?" Jake asked when the teenagers had gone home for the day and they were cleaning up the workshop together. "Long," Riley said, coiling an extension cord. "But worth it. I had a conference call with my father during the trip. He's actually impressed with what we're doing here." "Really? The great Robert Castellano is impressed with small-town water safety?" Riley laughed. "Don't sound so surprised. He's a businessman, but he's not heartless. When I showed him the statistics, how many lives we've potentially saved, how many communities are asking for the program, he started seeing it as a genuine investment in people." Over the past 6 months, Jake had slowly started to understand Riley's world better. He'd even met her father during one of Robert's rare visits to Virginia. The man was intimidating, sure, but he wasn't the monster Jake had imagined. He was protective of his daughter and suspicious of anyone who got close to her. But he also clearly loved her and wanted her to be happy. "Speaking of your father," Jake said, locking up the workshop, "he called me yesterday." Riley froze. "He called you? Why?" "Relax, it wasn't anything bad. He wanted to talk about expanding the program nationally. Apparently he's been getting calls from governors and education officials." They walked toward their cars as the sun set over the Virginia hills. This had become their routine. Work on the program during the day, then drive to Jake's apartment for dinner and conversation. Sometimes Riley stayed overnight, sleeping on his small couch because his apartment only had 1 bedroom. And she refused to let him give up his bed. It wasn't a conventional relationship by anyone's standards. Riley still lived in Los Angeles most of the time, still attended board meetings and charity events. Jake still worked construction 4 days a week and lived in the same small apartment above Murphy's Hardware. But somehow it worked. "There's something I need to tell you," Riley said when they reached their cars. Something in her tone made Jake's stomach tighten. Over the months, they'd learned to be completely honest with each other. But that didn't make serious conversations any easier. "Okay," Jake said simply. Riley leaned against her car, looking nervous for the first time in weeks. "My father offered me a position overseeing all of the company's charitable programs. It would mean traveling less, working more directly with communities like this one. Real work, not just photo opportunities." Jake felt a mix of emotions, pride that she was being recognized for her abilities, but also fear about what this might mean for them. "That's great. Riley, you'd be amazing at that." "There's more," she said. "The position is based in Richmond. I'd be moving to Virginia permanently." Jake's heart jumped. Over the past 6 months, the hardest part of their relationship had been the distance. Phone calls and text messages were fine, but nothing compared to actually being together, working side by side on something they both cared about. "What did you tell him?" Jake asked. "I told him I needed to talk to someone first." Riley stepped closer to him. Jake, I need to know if you think this could really work. Not just weekend visits and long-distance phone calls, but actually building a life together. Jake looked at her standing there in her work clothes, her hair messy from a day spent teaching kids how to use power tools, and he realized he'd never seen her look more beautiful. This was who she really was when she wasn't playing the role of a billionaire's daughter, someone who cared about making a real difference, someone who wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty. I've been thinking about that too, Jake said, and I think I have something to show you. He pulled out his phone and showed her a photo he'd taken that morning. It was a small house about 10 minutes outside of town. Nothing fancy, but it had good bones and a large workshop in the back. The kind of place where someone could build boats and teach water safety classes and maybe even start a family someday. It's for sale, Jake said. I've been saving money, and with what I'm earning from the program now. He trailed off, suddenly embarrassed. I know it's not much compared to what you're used to. Riley stared at the photo, then at Jake, then back at the photo. You're thinking about buying a house? I'm thinking about buying a house with someone, Jake said. If that someone is interested. Riley threw her arms around his neck, nearly knocking him backward. Yes, she said, laughing and crying at the same time. Yes, I'm very interested. They held each other in the parking lot as stars began to appear in the clear Virginia sky. Jake breathed in the scent of her hair and felt something settle in his chest, a sense of rightness he'd never experienced before. There's one condition, Jake said. Riley pulled back to look at him, eyebrow raised. We split the mortgage 50-50. I'm not being anyone's kept man. Riley laughed. Deal. But I get to pay for the workshop upgrades. Deal. A year later, they were married in the backyard of their new house, surrounded by an odd but wonderful mix of guests. Riley's father sat next to Mrs. Patterson, discussing home security systems. Tommy and his wife shared a table with Riley's college roommate. The kids from their water safety program served as unofficial ushers, proudly wearing the life jackets they'd helped design. Jake's wedding ring was simple. He'd made it himself in the workshop behind their house, crafting it from a piece of titanium left over from one of their boat-building classes. Riley's was equally simple, a thin band that wouldn't get caught on the equipment they used during their program demonstrations. During the ceremony, Jake looked out at the faces of people they'd taught to swim, kids they'd helped build their first boats, families they'd brought together through their work. This wasn't the fairy tale ending the media had tried to write about them. It was better than that. It was real. As they danced to music from Tommy's ancient boombox, Riley whispered in Jake's ear, Thank you. For what? For saving my life. Twice. Jake pulled her closer, thinking about that day on the California beach that had changed everything. He'd jumped into those waves to save a stranger, never imagining he'd end up saving himself in the process. Thank you for letting me, he whispered back. Around them, their friends and family celebrated under the Virginia stars, and somewhere in the distance, the river flowed steadily toward the sea, carrying with it all the stories of the people they'd taught to respect its power and beauty. Together, Jake and Riley had learned that the best kind of love wasn't about rescuing someone else. It was about building something meaningful together, one day at a time.